A very good morning to all of you students. This is Priya, your science teacher. In this video, I will explain you the chapter number 12 of your textbook, of your NCERT textbook, that is friction. In this chapter, we will learn about the friction, about the types of friction and the advantages and disadvantages of friction in our daily life. So this is the very interesting chapter to learn. So let us start this chapter with the definition of friction. First of all, what is friction or what is the force of friction? The friction, it is basically a physical force which opposes the motion of an object over a surface. Okay, the force of friction, it always acts between the object and the surface by which on the object is acting. For example, if we take an example of a friction, a ball rolling on the ground. This ball it gradually slows down after some time and it comes to rest because the surface, it opposes the motion of the rolling ball, and ultimately the ball, it comes to rest due to the force of friction acting between the ball and the ground. Second example, that if we stop pedaling a bicycle during running a bicycle, if we stop pedaling it, it also gradually slows down and comes to a stop due to the force of friction that acts between the surface and the bicycle, between the wheel and the road. So the surface, it opposes the motion of the bicycle and ultimately it will comes to rest. So this is some example of friction. These are the examples of friction. As you can see in this diagram, that friction is the opposing force and this is the object moving towards the surface. So this is the direction of the motion of an object and this is the direction of the friction. Basically the force of friction, it opposes the motion of an object. For example, the rolling of a ball and riding a bicycle. Next is the factors affecting the friction. Friction, it mainly depends upon only two factors, that the nature of the surface in contact, that what type of the surface it is moving on. For example, it is smooth or it is rough. So it depends on the nature of the surface. Second, it depends how hard the surface pressed together. Okay, if the weight of the object is very, then the friction it increases, and if the object is light in weight, then gradually the friction will decrease. So friction is less on a smooth surface as compared to the hard surface. So with this we can say that the friction, it depends only on two factors: the nature of the surface, whether it is smooth or rough, and how hard the surface it pressed together. This we can say that the friction is more on a rough surface, because when we start rolling a ball on a slide, then it will come to rest after some time. But if we slide a roller on a rough surface, then it will come to rest very immediately. So we can see that friction is more on a rough surface as compared to the smooth surface. Next, friction is more if the surfaces are pressed harder. This is the heavy weight box. If we slide this box towards the surface, then it is very difficult to slide this heavy weight box towards the surface because the friction is more. But if we slide this lightweight box on the surface, then it is comparatively easier because the weight of the box is very low and the friction comparatively is very less. So friction is more if the surfaces are pressed harder, and friction is less if the surfaces are not pressed harder. The next is the causes of friction. What causes friction to oppose the motion of an object? So friction, it is caused generally due to the interlocking of the irregularities between the two surfaces in contact. Irregularities is the arrangement of atoms on the surface. So it is caused due to the interlocking in between the two surfaces. So we can say that smooth surfaces, they have very less irregularities between the two surfaces. So the amount of friction is very less in case of smooth surfaces. But in contrast, the rough surfaces, they have very large irregularities between the two surfaces. So force of friction is more in rough surfaces as compared to the smooth surfaces. Like this, these are the irregularities that cause the force of friction to act. Or this is the interlocking between the two surfaces by which a force of friction can act on. Next is the types of friction. Frictions are basically of three types, that is static friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. Static friction, it is the friction that exerted on an object at, for example, if a person is standing on a chair or standing straight, then it is an example of a static friction. Next is the sliding friction. Sliding friction, it is basically a friction exerted when an object it slides over any surface. For example, a child sliding on a slide, it is an example of a sliding friction. Third is the rolling friction. Rolling friction is the friction exerted when an object rolls over any surface. Okay, for example, if we roll a cylinder on a surface, then it is an example of a rolling friction. Sliding friction, the amount of sliding friction is slightly less than the static friction, because in case of sliding friction, the object starts its journey or it displaces from the position having the high potential energy. So we can say that the sliding friction is slightly less than the static friction. In case of rolling friction, it is the amount of this friction is less than the sliding friction and static friction, because in rolling friction the irregularities between the surface are more as compared to the sliding friction and the static friction. So these are the examples of the types of friction. This is the example of a static friction, this is the example of a sliding friction, and this is the example of a rolling friction. The next is the usefulness or the advantages of friction in our daily lives. As we all know that friction, it plays a very important role in our daily activities. For example, the friction between the feet and the ground, it helps us to walk on the ground. It is impossible to write with a pen or pencil on a paper without the friction. So the friction between the pen or pencil or between the pen and the paper, it helps us to write on a paper, and it is possible to write on a blackboard due to the presence of a friction between the chalk and the blackboard. So these are some daily activities in which friction plays a very important role. So these are the examples of some daily activities in which friction helps us to do these activities. For example, holding a glass, it is also an example of a friction. Walking on a road, writing on a blackboard, moving in a car and writing on a paper with the help of a pen, these are all examples of a. But sometimes the friction is sometimes undesirable. So we can say that because of the friction there are various disadvantages on our daily lives also. For example, the soles of shoes we wear out due to friction. The tires of bicycles and automobiles, they wear out due to the friction. The steps of staircases and foot over the bridges in railway stations, they wear out due to the friction. Knives and razors, they lose their sharpness or they lose their sharp edges due to the presence of the force of friction. So sometimes it can be undesirable. So these are some examples of the disadvantages of friction. The next is the how can we increase the friction on a surface. So we can increase the friction by increasing the roughness of the surface in contact, or we can say that by increasing the irregularities in between the two surfaces. For example, the soles of shoes, they are grooved to have a better grip on the floor. The tires of vehicles they are treated so that to increase the grip on the road. The braking pads or the brakes of the vehicles, they are rough to so that they can stop the moving vehicles when the brakes are applied. And gymnasts, they apply some coarse substance on their hands for a better grip. So these are some ways by which you can increase the friction between the two surfaces. The next is reducing friction, that how can we reduce the friction between the two surfaces by simply by decreasing the irregularities between the two surfaces or by decreasing the interlocking. So friction can be reduced by using lubricants like powders, oils and grease, by using rollers or wheels, by using the ball bearings. We can sprinkle powder on a carom board to reduce the friction. Oil or grease is applied between moving parts of the machines or between doors and between windows to reduce the friction. Rollers are used in luggage bags to reduce the frictions. Wheels are used in vehicles to reduce friction. Ball bearings are used in ceiling fans. bicycles and vehicles to reduce the friction. So these are some examples of our daily lives by which we can reduce the friction by applying the lubricants or by decreasing the interlocking between the two surfaces. The last is the fluid friction. This is a very important. Fluid friction, it is the friction, force of friction or the physical force that is exerted by a liquid or gas. Okay, so basically fluid friction, it is the force of friction exerted by liquid and gases on objects moving through them. Okay, for example, birds flying in the air, they are opposed by the force of friction present in air. Fishes living in water, they are opposed by the motion of the water. For aeroplanes and spacecraft, they have they experience a fluid friction. So these all are examples of the fluid friction. Fluid friction, it basically depends upon the speed of an object, that whether the object is moving fastly or whether the object is moving slowly. Second is the shape of an object. If the shape of an object is pointed or streamlined, that the force of friction will reduce. But if the shape of an object is wide, then the friction will gradually increases. The third is the nature of the fluid. If the fluid is more viscous, then definitely the friction will increase, and the fluid, if it is or fluid or gas, it is less viscous or it is less dense, then the friction will decrease. The next is some examples of fluid friction are birds flying in air. They have streamlined body because their bodies are designed in such a way so that they can reduce the amount of friction acting on them. So birds flying in the air, they have streamlined body to reduce the fluid friction. Fishes living in water, they also have streamlined body to reduce the fluid friction. Aeroplanes and spacecraft, they have streamlined body to reduce the fluid friction. So this is the concept of fluid friction. These are some examples of a fluid friction. For example, a bird flying on a air, aeroplane and spacecraft flying on air, fishes living in water, and the spacecraft, they travel in the air. So these are some examples of the. I hope you have understood this chapter very well, and if you have any doubt, you can contact me anytime. Thank you.